In the 1st century before the Common Era, the Roman Empire was the undisputed center of the known world. Its roads sliced through continents like surgical incisions. Its aqueducts defied gravity to feed monumental public baths. Its marble temples stood as towering testaments to what seemed like a divinely ordained, genetically superior intellect. To the Roman citizen, sitting in the warm Mediterranean sun, wrapped in imported silks, and eating Egyptian grain, this global dominance was not a historical accident. It was the natural order. It was empirical, undeniable proof of their biological and spiritual superiority. And everyone else? The Germanic tribes, the Scythian nomads, the Celtic clans? They were simply born of lesser clay, destined by nature to be ruled. The great orator Cicero, writing to his wealthy friend Atticus, offered a piece of highly practical advice regarding the Roman campaigns in northern Europe. He wrote,
"Do not buy slaves from Britain, for they are incredibly stupid, entirely untalented, and utterly incapable of learning letters or music."
Imagine that moment. To the highly refined Roman mind, the blue-painted, mud-splattered Celts roaming the damp, suffocating forests of Britannia were genetically hard-coded for barbarism. They lacked the biological brain power to build complex societies, the cognitive capacity for high philosophy, or the linguistic depth to ever grasp the beauty of literature. Rome's supremacy was viewed as an eternal, biological constant. The Britons' inferiority was absolute, written into the very marrow of their bones, or so the conquerors thought. 2,000 years later, a mere blink in the eyes of evolutionary time, the descendants of those exact uncivilizable British tribes ruled an empire that made Rome look like a regional playground. They built the steam engines that launched the Industrial Revolution, mapped the mechanics of gravity, and colonized the globe. What changed in those 2 millennia? Did their DNA magically restructure itself in a few dozen generations? Did their brains suddenly sprout entirely new, highly advanced cognitive pathways? Did some evolutionary miracle suddenly elevate the stupid Vert into a global administrator? No. The biology remained identical. The cranial capacity was unchanged. The variable was never the blood flowing through their veins. The variable was the dirt beneath their feet. Humanity suffers from a profound, deeply embedded psychological coping mechanism. When we succeed, we desperately attribute it to our internal genius, our work ethic, our inherent superiority. When we fail, we blame our external circumstances. But when we look at entire civilizations, we make a far more dangerous historical mistake. We confuse environmental luck with genetic destiny. We look at the ruins of empires and assume the builders were simply smarter than the people they conquered. Let us strip away the romantic mythology of empire and look at the raw, cold, uncaring physics of geography. Why did Rome develop massive stone infrastructure, legal codes, and written histories, while the tribes of northern Europe lived in timber huts and relied on oral traditions? Was it a surplus of genius, or was it a surplus of geographic luxury? To build what we call civilization, a society requires a highly specific set of environmental winning lottery tickets. You do not build a city-state on sheer willpower. You build it on thermodynamic surplus. First, you need domesticable crops, wild wheat, barley, and pulses that provide a high caloric yield for minimal farming effort. Second, you need heavy domesticable draft animals, oxen, cattle, horses, to multiply human physical labor by a factor of 10. And third, you need an east-west geographic axis. Look at a map of Eurasia. It stretches from Spain to China along the same latitudinal lines. This means a crop or an animal domesticated in the Fertile Crescent can spread thousands of miles east or west, encountering the exact same climate, daylight hours, and seasonal shifts. Technology and agriculture can flow freely. Now look at the Americas or Africa. They stretch north to south, cutting across radically different climate zones, deserts, and rainforests. A crop domesticated in one region dies if you move it a few hundred miles north or south. Furthermore, try domesticating a wild African zebra or a North American bison. It is biologically impossible. Their survival instincts make them untamable. Meanwhile, the Eurasian horse and ox were docile, thermodynamic miracles waiting to be harnessed. Rome sat directly at the crossroads of this geographic goldmine. It didn't invent agriculture. It inherited thousands of years of agricultural trial and error from Mesopotamia. It had access to deep-water shipping lanes, predictable Mediterranean climates, and easily accessible iron ore. The northern Celts, meanwhile, were locked in a geographic chokehold. They faced dense, unbroken primeval forests, highly acidic soils, and brutally short growing seasons. They weren't stupid. They were simply spending 95% of their daily cognitive bandwidth trying not to freeze to death before the next winter ended. Civilization is not a measure of genetic intelligence. It is a measure of calorie surplus. When a society has a surplus of energy, it can afford to feed a class of people who do not farm: philosophers, engineers, administrators, and soldiers. When that surplus is absent, survival consumes every ounce of human potential. But the conqueror, standing atop his stone tower, looks down at the starving survivor in the mud and concludes, "I am smart, and you are primitive." It is written in our genes. By the 19th century, this ancient primal urge to justify dominance found a new, terrifyingly clinical ally: pseudoscience. The conquerors of the Victorian era no longer claimed divine right or cultural prestige. They claimed objective, biological measurement. They wanted data to prove their cruelty was simply natural law. Enter Samuel George Morton, a highly celebrated physician and anatomist from Philadelphia. Morton possessed a singular, dark obsession: human skulls. Throughout the 1830s and 40s, he gathered a vast collection of hundreds of crania from across the globe, representing different races, cultures, and historical eras. His objective was seemingly pure: to measure the internal volume of the human brain case and correlate it with intellectual capacity. Morton's methodology was hailed across the Western world as the absolute peak of objective, empirical science. He stuffed the empty skulls with black mustard seed, and later lead shot, measuring the precise volume of material each skull could hold in cubic inches. Unsurprisingly, his published data beautifully matched the social prejudices of his era. Caucasian skulls held the most volume, Native American skulls held significantly less, African skulls held the least. This was not just bad science. It was a moral slaughterhouse disguised as objective data. Morton's measurements were immediately weaponized in the United States Congress and across European courts to justify chattel slavery, the systematic displacement of indigenous populations, and the brutal, bloody march of colonialism. After all, if the scientific data proved they were intellectually inferior, keeping them in chains or taking their land was practically an act of paternal mercy. But science, when stripped of imperial bias, is a brutal mirror. More than a century later, modern researchers reanalyzed Morton's famous collection. What they uncovered was a masterclass in unconscious and highly convenient bias. Morton had systematically oversampled small female skulls from non-European groups and heavily sampled large male skulls from European groups. He packed the seeds into European skulls with immense physical force, while loosely pouring them into African skulls. Most importantly, he had completely confused physical stature with inherent intellect. People who live in colder climates or have access to multi-generational high-protein diets tend to have larger physical frames, and therefore larger skulls. Morton didn't measure raw cognitive potential. He measured the physical height of people who had been lucky enough to eat well and live in warm brick houses, and called it intellect. He didn't measure the human soul. He only measured the shadow cast by historical privilege, and called it biology. It is easy for us, sitting in the comfort of the 21st century, to look back at Cicero's arrogance or Samuel George Morton's biased seed packing and scoff at their primitive ignorance. We pat ourselves on the back, believing we have evolved past such crude, unscientific biological tribalism. But we haven't. The horror didn't end. It simply upgraded its software. It traded the brass calipers for digital spreadsheets. Today, we no longer measure the temples of skulls. Instead, we use standardized testing, standardized IQ metrics, and algorithmic hiring assessments. We have constructed a highly clinical corporate meritocracy that operates on the exact same psychological delusion. Let us look at the history of the IQ test itself. When Alfred Binet invented the first intelligence scale in France in 1905, he explicitly warned that his test should never be used to measure innate, permanent intelligence. He designed it as a diagnostic tool to identify children who were falling behind in school so they could receive extra help. But when the test crossed the Atlantic, American eugenicists immediately seized it. They stripped away Binet's compassion and turned the test into a weapon of categorization, using it to justify the forced sterilization of tens of thousands of citizens deemed morally or intellectually deficient. Today, we do the same. We look at communities, neighborhoods, or entire nations struggling with the generational trauma of poverty, high crime, and systemic collapse. And we whisper the modern version of Cicero's warning: they simply lack the cognitive infrastructure. They don't have the work ethic. Their test scores are lower. But we ignore the modern geography. We ignore the neurological poison of lead pipes in low-income housing, which permanently stunts brain development. We ignore the chronic, toxic stress of food insecurity, which neuroscientists have proven can drop a person's functional cognitive capacity by up to 13 IQ points overnight. We ignore the fact that standardized testing doesn't measure raw human brilliance. It measures the financial security, the tutoring budget, and the structural stability of the household the child was lucky enough to be born into. Just like the ancient Romans, we mistake our modern environmental luxuries, our stable high-speed internet, our quiet air-conditioned study rooms, our high-protein diets, for inherent biological merit. We reduce human beings to biological robots, grading them like factory products on a conveyor belt. If your algorithmic metric is low, the modern system deems you defective. It strips away your intrinsic human worth and tells you that your economic suffering is your own genetic fault. It is the ultimate transaction. We demand that a human being prove their utility to a broken machine before we grant them the basic right to dignity. If history teaches us anything, it is that the thrones of supremacy are built on shifting sands. The hyper-developed empire of today is the dust-swept ruins of tomorrow. The people we cast aside as uncivilizable, inefficient, or low metric today are merely waiting for their geographic and systemic winter to end. Given the right environment, the right nourishment, and the absence of survival stress, the human mind flourishes in ways no algorithm can predict. We must reject this transactional lie. We must refuse to view our brothers, our sisters, and ourselves as mere metrics on a standardized test or biological units of labor for a corporate apparatus. Your worth is not determined by the volume of your skull, the score on your test, or the geopolitical luck of the coordinate system where your mother gave birth to you. Human value is intrinsic. It is a baseline. It cannot be earned, and it must never be measured by a system designed to justify its own dominance. The next time you see someone struggling in the margins of society, shut out by the metrics, broken by the system, remember Cicero looking at the British Celts. Remember Samuel George Morton packing lead shot into his empty brass skulls to ease his own conscience. And ask yourself, am I actually superior, or am I just incredibly lucky? Wake up, reject the machine, reclaim your soul. This is Outer Enigma.